Hey, folks, greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Secure IT 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Spencer here, as well as myself, Brad. And I love today's topic, talking about deception technology to detect cyber attacks. So I'm excited about this. I've been a longtime fan. I think we talked about it, like kind of touched on it a few times, but I don't know that we've had an episode to talk about the benefits of deception in the cyberspace from a defender perspective. So yeah, I'm stoked, man.
Yeah, definitely. Like you said, it's something we've talked about before, in kind of passing in various episodes. And if you're a longtime listener, first time caller kind of thing, you probably recall some of those. But I wanted to dig into deception as a whole topic. I'm working on a webinar for it, so look out for that from Secure IT 360 from us. It's going to be super fun. I'm not going to spoil it yet, but it's going to be a super fun presentation because there's a lot of different like fun themes you can do with this. But anyways, I wanted to do a specific podcast on deception for a couple of reasons. One, it's not used enough, and I think we both agree with that. It's not nearly used enough. It's not nearly talked about enough as a means to detect and deter threat actors and cyber attacks and mitigate those things. So that's one reason. The other reason is it's a really high fidelity, low false positive, defensive control that you can implement in your environment. And the third reason is it's not super expensive. Like you don't have to buy really expensive commercial products to do this. You, with a little bit of research and a little bit of understanding and planning, you can set this stuff up for relatively low cost or free. And we're going to talk about all of that in this episode. We're going to talk about what deception is, how you can use it for threat detection, and kind of talk about the different types of deception that you can use, and throw out some examples of the tools you can use, the open source projects, and mainly talk about those various different things and how you can implement it into your defensive security strategy. So that's what this episode is about, and I hope everybody gets value and takes something away from it.
Yeah, man, I love the topic. I love the direction that you're taking it. One of the things that, well, let me back up for a minute. I first learned about the existence of deception in the cyberspace probably like 10 or 15 years ago. And I found out about it through a company called Thinkst, and they make something called the Canary. I'm sure we're going to talk about that. But they kind of like cold called me, right? And I was like, this sounds like an awful idea. Why would I put something on my network that's like, that's like low hanging fruit for bad guys? And then the deeper we got into it, the more I was like, okay, cool. And then, the price was inexpensive, and then and we actually got a true positive not long after we implemented one of these things.
Yep.
It was an insider threat thing, not, another story for another day, but I was convinced at that point, right? Like we were spending like a couple $100 for each of these things.
Yep.
And we caught somebody doing something bad that we probably wouldn't have caught otherwise.
Yep.
Ever since then, I've been a fan. Right. And it's evolved a lot. It's not just what it was. Cause I think back then it was like a Raspberry Pi in a box, dude. Like super simple, but you can get really deep with this. It's actually a really cool, approach. So,
Yeah. And this episode, and this podcast is not sponsored by Thinkst. But both
maybe it should be, man.
Maybe it should be. Haroon, if you're listening, call us up. No, right. But it would be really cool to have Haroon on the podcast, by the way, because he's just super interesting. And I was just talking to him on Twitter about a YouTube video or a talk that was on YouTube like 8 years ago. It's like it's the T2 conference in Finland or something from like 8 years ago. And he's talking about all this stuff, and it's still relevant today about offense and defense. But anyways, Thinkst is a great product, great company, and they make one of the things, they make free and open source tools, and we'll talk about that in the tools section. And they have a commercial product, so full disclosure for there, but great stuff. And there's a number of other tools that we'll point out as well, free and open source. But the main kind of discussion point I wanted to get to was threat detection and taking a step back a little bit, deception comes in a lot of different forms, right? There's a lot of different types of deception. And Brad, based on your background, you have a good perspective on this as well. And maybe that would be insight for people to share kind of the analogies there. Maybe that'll sink in. But for me, like deception is threat detection. It includes obfuscation and it includes intelligence. So it's kind of deliberate misdirection, right? You're deliberately misdirecting or confusing or, getting information about a threat actor and their TTPs in order to make your defenses more robust, to detect those threats earlier. So there's a lot that goes into deception. It's not a very small subject once you dig into it. So this podcast will try to keep it focused on just kind of like the threat detection aspects of it. So more or less, how do I use deception technology to catch threat actors in my environment early in the chain? And we'll talk about why that's important here in a minute. But maybe from your background, Brad, talk about deception for a minute.
Yeah, man. So, what immediately comes to mind for me is the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops. If you don't know what that is, I encourage you to look it up. It's an amazing story. During World War II, the Allied forces actually stood up a ghost army. And it was an entire army with real paperwork, but it was a bunch of inflatable fake, um, you know, components, right? So like tanks, airplanes, trucks, all this stuff. But from a Axis, spy plane perspective, or from a viewer that's really far away, it looked like a full army, right? And so it was just a really neat act of deception during World War II, and it had a significant impact on the war. But that's just kind of the preface, right? So there are a couple of aspects that come into play when you do something like this, right? So first of all, can they even figure out that it's there in the first place, right? So just the act of reacting to the presence of a fake army, we were able to tell that they had certain types of intelligence, right? Because we had visibility into their communications. So we can infer things about their capabilities before we even get to how they react to it and all the other things, right? So this is a very deep and complex topic, and there's a tremendous amount of information you can gain from deception, not just like in a honeypot style where they bombed it, wow, yeah, we used up their bombs. No, dude, like the way that they detected us tells us a little bit about their capabilities. So really cool story, and it's a neat part of history.
Yep.
But it speaks to the benefits and some of the aspects of this. So.
Yep. Yeah, knowing you, I knew you'd have like a military history type story, so I was really excited to hear that.
That felt personal.
Yeah. But super awesome. So yeah, deception goes by many names. It's a very deep subject in a lot of applications. And what's great about it too is it's one of those things in security that have direct applications outside of security. And what I mean is like you can pull inspiration from military history, from political type of campaigns, from espionage stuff and like corporate espionage, and like there's a lot of different aspects to deception that you can pull from and kind of incorporate in your defensive strategy. So it's known by many names: active defense, proactive defense, defensive deception, offensive countermeasures, cyber deception. There's a lot of names for it for those who are not aware. And obviously they can take various shapes and forms, and we're going to talk about that. Some of the more commonly known names or nomenclatures for these are canaries, honeypots, honey tokens, decoys, lures, stuff like that. And what I wanted to get to in kind of the introduction section here before we dive into like the types of canaries, or the type of deception rather, and how to use them, is the why this is important. And I think that's what a lot of people miss in this discussion, and why it's not talked about enough is not super clear to me. But what is clear is the time to exploit is exponentially getting faster. Like you look at any vendor report, you look at the rate at the MOVEits and all the various log4js and stuff like that have like hit the news, that's been really popular and groundbreaking, and the time to exploit is increasing very rapidly, and threat actors are now chomping at the bit to attack as soon as they possibly can, right? As soon as something is vulnerable, as soon as there's a POC released or something, we're seeing, scanning activity. The industry is seeing that scanning activity, the exploitation behaviors, etc. So it's really important that our time to detect also drops. We
Right.
also have to drop that time to detection because exploitation of these issues, of these vulnerabilities, is increasing very rapidly.
Yeah, man. And I think if we take a step back, right, like at a super high level and start looking at how we react to that in the cyberspace, right? Because this plays really well into your overall strategy. So we know they're going to get in, right? If they're good. We know they're going to be quick. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we can't always stop everything. So that leads us to kind of layer 2, if you will. Layer 2 is going to be detection, right? And so when we're talking about a layered strategic approach to cybersecurity from a defensive perspective, slowing them down or catching them earlier in the process is going to be critical for your ability to identify and contain this before it gets bad.
Yeah.
Because we've proven time and time and time again, doesn't matter how good you are, we'll find a way in. The only question is, do you catch us? Right. And
Yep.
and this is, a column in that larger spreadsheet of proactive defenses, right? That kind of that serve that role, if that makes
Yep.
sense.
Yeah, and in that T2 talk by Harun Mir that I was listening to from 8 years ago now, he talks about, the nomenclature, or kind of like the idea that attackers need to be right once and defenders have to be right all the time is something that he challenged a bit, because attackers have to, in attackers get to pick the time they attack, right? Like they get to pick the time. They're picking the time, and when they do it, it might be Christmas Eve or New Year's or whatever. But defenders should pick the environment, right? Like the attacker is attacking your environment, so you should defend your environment as if it's a battlefield,
Yeah.
right? So the attackers get to pick the time, you get to pick the battlefield. And I think that's very empowering for people to hear, is that yes, there is some idea that attackers only need to be right once to get in the environment, but once they're there, that's your battlefield and that's your battleground, and you should use that appropriately. You know what I
Mhm.
mean? So there's also the increased reliance on living off the land and using legitimate tools, using known good tools. This is something we've been doing since we started doing the internal pen testing, is using legitimate Microsoft tools, like AD Explorer, using RMM tools, using PDQ deploy, NetScan, for example, RDP, all these living off the land tools and techniques is becoming much more popular,
Mhm.
or is seemingly a trend going forward from threat actors, because they're known good, right? They're signed, they're otherwise legitimate tools. They're not, malicious binaries that are doing these weird process injection things, or things that EDRs have been built to detect,
Right.
right? EDR is not going to detect just installation of a random RMM tool unless it's been configured to do that, right?
Yeah.
It's not an inherently risky thing, installing software.
I think it's part of the cat and mouse game, right? Is as we have improved our EDR capabilities, and let's be real, man, in the last decade, we have dramatically, I say we like I was involved in it, but like, EDR
Totally
has
you.
become, I know, it's all me. But, the EDR has improved 1,000-fold, right? From a capability perspective. And the harder we make it for them to use bad tools, they're going to find another way to do it. And I think this is just a logical
Yep.
evolution in threat actor TTPs. And now again, cat and mouse game, right? Now we're like, okay, cool. You're doing all this living off the land stuff, which we should probably tell the audience what that means in more detail. I know you just mentioned it, but like,
Yep.
we use that a lot. So, but yeah, so I think it's natural for them to pivot to that, right?
Yep.
And so now we're going to spin up all this defensive technology around that, and they're going to pivot to something else. But yeah, I think it's all part of the cat and mouse game, and this was the
Yep.
logical next step.
Yeah, and living off the land, for those listening in who may not be all in on the lingo, is just using the tools that are available to you on the operating system or the host that you're on. So if a threat actor compromises Susie's machine, Susie's computer and accounting, right? It's a Windows machine. She'll have access to CMD and PowerShell and RDP, all the built-in functionality of Windows.
Yeah.
And a lot of those tools have kind of hidden or lesser known functionality that allows you to say, download a file. So there's a program called certutil that is used for, requesting certificate templates and doing stuff with certificates in Windows. You can actually use that to download files. Bitsadmin is another one. It's another program in Windows. So there's a lot of these programs, and I consider the corollary to that, or the follow on, is those known good tools, like I mentioned, like PDQ deploy and the RMM products and stuff like that.
Yep. And it doesn't even have to be a built-in tool, right? So like one of the low-hanging fruit that I used to look at on internals is there's always this IT software share, right, sitting on the network, and it's full of all these delicious tools, man, tools that are used by IT support to solve problems. Maybe there's software packages that are deploying from it, and so that's another really good example of like, hey, what can I use from that?
Yep.
Because presumably these are all trusted tools, right? Because you're using them in your environment.
Yep.
That's a great opportunity for something, in a similar vein of living off what's already there. So,
Yep. Yeah, and the last thing I want to talk about is like why deception is important is dwell times. Again, looking at threat reports and kind of seeing the trends and reading between the lines, despite our best efforts, dwell times are not dropping like we'd like, right? They're not necessarily dropping to the point where it's making a dent in our defenses, right? In some cases, they are highly dependent on the organization in the industry. But if you look at the trends, threat actors, because of the use of living off the land, because of the increase, like the speed at which they're exploiting these things, a lot of times threat actors can be in an environment for a long time still without detection. And that early detection becomes really, really important, because if there's a threat actor in the environment for a really long time, we obviously want to be able to implement defensive controls to identify them sooner, right? Like that should be a natural conclusion. So I think that's a really important aspect too, is dwell times to improve the speed at which we detect.
Let's just slow them down a little bit, or pick them up faster, one or the other. But we've got to react to their ability to move quickly. Yeah.
Yep. So benefits, we kind of talked about it a little already in kind of like the why section here, but early detection of threats, I mentioned in the beginning of this episode, high fidelity, low false positives. So one of the benefits of this deception stuff is if you lay the traps appropriately and they're configured right and they're kind of along the attack path of an attacker, they're usually going to be indicators that someone is doing something that they shouldn't, right? Maybe it's an employee snooping around in an HR share, looking at, salary documents, or maybe it's credentials on an IT share or something like that, or it's an account, or it's some sort of honeypot thing that is, being port scanned. The idea is that these deception tools that we lay out there and the traps that we lay out should present high fidelity, meaning high signal, low false positive. So if somebody's doing something bad they shouldn't be doing, and that's a real strong indicator to kind of go and look at that.
Yeah, and that's one of the huge benefits here, right? Is when you implement these things, and they're only limited by your creativity, right? It could be as simple as just creating a fake account with a really easy to guess password. But the probability of someone accidentally logging into that, or some other process or whatever it is, kind of activating whatever your deception technique is very low, right? Because we're creating them where they're you have to be purposefully going after these techniques, and we're going to deep dive into the techniques. But that's part of the reason that it's such a low false positive is, if I'm looking for people port scanning my network, like that's not a routine thing that occurs on accident, right? So yeah, man, it's
Yep.
amazing from that regard, by comparison to other things, right? By comparison to things like MDR, EDR that are generating tons and tons of alerts or tons and tons of logs,
Yep.
got to be sifted through, and you can miss stuff because of the volume and all that, but this is not that, right? This is a lot more accurate.
Yeah, and something that I just thought of that I wanted to remember to add to this episode was that one of the benefits is you can deploy these where EDR is not possible or not feasible. Whether that's IoT networks, that could be on Linux appliances like firewalls or routers or cameras. You can deploy these canaries, these deception techniques in places where you can't put traditional security tools. And that's a very powerful benefit because, I posted on LinkedIn yesterday or something, and it's like, starting a pen test on a printer network is not realistic, right? And then some people chimed in and like, "Well, look at this article about this camera being hacked, and then the threat actor pivoted from that." And I'm like, yes, that's absolutely possible. Like that's happened before. That is definitely a feasible thing. It is a concern. Is it the norm? No, definitely not. But that indicates to me, and why I want to point this out, is that we can deploy deception technologies and tools and techniques where traditional security monitoring doesn't fit or is not supported, right? I think that's the big takeaway. And then the other thing is like disrupting and confusing and slowing the attackers down. Like you said, there's been times when I've been on pen tests, many times where I'm like, that file looks like kind of like a canary. Like it could be. It's like called passwords.doc, and it's like right there in an open share. And I'm like, maybe that's a tripwire, maybe that's a canary. And what that does to me as an attacker is it makes me slow down. It makes me second guess my actions. It makes me second guess the things that I'm looking at. Like, is this actually a password document? Am I going to get caught from this, from opening this? So it slows them down. It makes them second guess their actions. And maybe if they feel like, oh, I might be burned because of this canary thing that I opened, they might just use a bunch of tools to kind of like speed their process along or speed their operation along. And that will give you, some interesting intelligence about their TTPs and whatnot.
Yeah, totally agree, dude. So one of the things that we did in the banking world was we would deploy these in networks that had IoT devices, right? So think like check sorting machines. Think about cash counting machines. Think about like these large scale industrial printers that we have.
Mm-hmm.
I can't put EDR on that, dude. And we're already segmenting them off into their own network. And so our strategy was to spin up a honey device that mimicked the behavior of that. We did it for voice over IP phones too, by the way, Cisco phones.
Yep.
And so we had one of these in each one of these networks where we had limited visibility. And our kind of like secret trick was to make sure they were as early on in the network range as they could be. So if I had a slash, 24,
Yep.
it was the first or second IP in
Yep.
the list that was active. Because like we understand how threat actors work, right? I'm going to discover this environment and there's 10 of these. This guy's the first IP. There's a reasonably good possibility that person's going to start there.
Yeah.
So yeah, we did this kind of stuff all the time. And because those networks are just really difficult to defend if someone manages to pivot into them.
Yep. Absolutely. So let's talk about types of deception now. There's quite a few names here. There's quite a few like deception tools and kind of techniques.
Mm-hmm.
I thought we would kind of talk about kind of like 3 high level buckets of techniques, but there's quite a bit. Like when you get into this subject, there's quite a bit that goes into this. And everything from, disruption and denial and like actively, disrupting a threat actor's machine. Like if they get on a machine, maybe you have a tool that denial of services that host, right? Essentially taking it offline or, kind of goes beyond isolation. So canaries and honey tokens is one bucket that I want to cover. Honeypots is the next because they're a little bit different. Mm-hmm. And then lures I wanted to cover is kind of like everything else kind of bucket, miscellaneous that don't fit into those other two. So canaries and honey tokens. These are traditionally files or applications or processes, something that is like a very distinct, like kind of an atomic thing that's used to identify possible unauthorized activity. So they're used, and again, a lot of these are used for interaction-based activities. So when a threat actor interacts with a canary or interacts with a honey token, that's when the alert is fired. And these are typically planted in various locations. So one example that I mentioned earlier is like a password file, right? Mm-hmm. That would be like a canary file or a honey file, depending on how you want to talk about it or what words you want to use. But that would be like a password file or an HR document in a file share, for example. Mm-hmm. And the reason that's really cool is, again, it's planted in a place where somebody who shouldn't be looking is looking, right? And it's planted in a strategic location along that attack path. And we've got a number of examples, but that's the first one is the canaries and the honey tokens. And those come in a lot of varieties and shapes and forms. Everything from You can get mobile applications for your phone. You can put canaries on your website, on your login pages when they're cloned. I know you've talked about doing that before.
Yep.
And there's a lot of really cool examples. There's credit card numbers and email accounts and SQL credentials and AWS keys. There's a lot of different types of canaries and canary tokens and honey tokens here.
Yeah, and look, man, you don't have to spend a lot of time and money on this. It does not have to be complex. It can be, right? You can really take this to the nth degree, but it can literally be as simple as spinning up a user in your M365 environment with an easy to guess password and setting up an alert, and just make sure that there's no access from that user or anything like that. But you will know if somebody authenticates to that account, that it's no good, right? So, and it can be any of those things. You talked about files, like
Yep.
it can really be very simple and very low cost and with a lot of value there. Or,
Yep.
to some of these other really cool and complex examples, you can have a file that executes code in the background that actually like gains intelligence about the attacker. Like you can really go far, but you can start small, man. This doesn't have to be a big
Yep.
undertaking. And I feel like, at least, in my experience talking to peers, that has always been, holding them back a little bit. Oh, it's complicated. It's a
Yep.
lot of work. I don't want to, and they already have a million things going on. So why am I going to spend time doing this? It's really not that big of an investment from either time or money.
Yeah. And a lot of people don't know where to start, right?
Yeah.
With
Yeah. Good point.
deception. And what my advice would be is to look at something like the DEFA report and look at your own data, right? If you've had security events before or incidents, look at those reports, look at the data from those incidents and those events and your pen test reports, right? If a pen tester was able to pivot, find credentials in a share, move laterally with RDP, get access to a server that's got a scheduled task running as a domain admin, maybe some of those things you could turn into canaries. So, for example, one canary that I would recommend is a scheduled task that's running as a privileged user, but make that user not able to log on, make that user have a really long password. And then there are ways you can kind of restrict that account so it can't log on, it can't be used anywhere. But if that scheduled task is modified, you can get an alert, right? So there's a lot of creative ways you can do it. So my advice for like where to start with deception technology is to look at your previous history with security incidents and pen tests and look at threat reports like the DEFA report and find areas in your environment where you can plant files and canaries and all these different things
Mm-hmm.
to identify threat actors and to identify them in specific places in their attack chain, right?
Yep. Yep. One of the other things that we've done in the past, and this I just remembered this, is embedding strings in code. Right? If you are concerned about your source code getting leaked, or I'll tell you kind of the story really quick. Is we were able to detect a third party developer that had made a git commit with our code
Mm.
into a public repo. And we picked it up within 24 hours because we were scanning the internet and searching for this very unique string that had been intentionally placed in the code. And I mean, it was an honest mistake, but we caught that super freaking early
Mm.
because we were taking proactive countermeasures in case that code ever landed somewhere public. We'd find it as
Yep.
quickly as it could be indexed by Google, right?
Yep.
And so there's a lot of really creative things you can do with this.
Yeah, and shout out to again Thinks that hosts a really awesome free resource for everyone in the community called Canary Tokens. Just Google Canary Tokens and you'll find the website, and that has, I don't know, 100, maybe more different Canary tokens that are free that you can use.
Hmm.
That'll send you an alert when that specific canary is triggered. So they have it for free. They also have an open source version of that, so you can use your own.
Hmm.
And again, with the honeypot section we're talking about here in a second, they also have a free and open. They call it Open Canary, which is their kind of like their honeypot system or parts of it that
Yep.
is free and open source.
Yeah, dude. They do great work. Super cool company, by the way, to work with. Again, I feel like we should get like a sponsorship from them or something. But I mean, it's just good. It is what it is,
Yeah.
man.
So honeypots. Honeypots are decoy systems. So they are systems that mimic real endpoints, real devices, real kind of workstations or servers, IoT devices, etc. So
Hmm.
they mimic real devices that a threat actor would maybe be able to interact with. There's kind of varying shapes and forms of this. They can be like low interaction. So maybe it's just they have ports that look to be open, and all you can do is just kind of port scan. You can't log in or can't access the system at all.
Hmm.
Or there are some where you could actually log into SSH and you get into an actual Unix environment, and you're just, it's an isolated, contained thing. And the threat actor is just kind of spinning their wheels, kind of burning their TTPs, if you will, on
Hmm.
those things. So there's kind of low interaction and high interaction honeypots. But my example and kind of things I think of are like what you mentioned earlier, like a fake server on a subnet that's like the PCI subnet, right?
Hmm.
Or the PCI environment.
Yep.
Or maybe a fake, on-premise domain controller or something, right? So maybe it's like an actual physical device that has certain ports open, like 53 for DNS and stuff like that, that make it look like a domain controller, right? And those are two examples that come to mind that I've seen on engagements, right? But can work really well in terms of this like honeypot decoy system kind of thing.
Yeah, man. And one of our techniques for implementing full honeypot systems was literally just adding, like you said, a file server into our subnet where all the other file servers were, and have the same naming convention, all that stuff, but it's not published in Active Directory. And the only way you would find it is if you were scanning for
Mm-hmm.
file servers on a network, right? So like a user, it would be
Yep.
impossible for a user under normal operating conditions to stumble onto this thing.
Yep.
And so, there's always that aspect of it, right? Like we want to make it easy-ish,
Yep.
but we don't want to make it so easy that you can just stumble into it and create a bunch of false positives. So yeah, dude, the
Yeah. A
honeypots are legit.
file server with a hidden share called IT scripts, right? So
Beautiful,
it's,
beautiful, man. Yeah.
yeah. And you put a bunch of PowerShell scripts in there that don't have any credentials in them, or maybe that you do, and that's an additional decoy kind of thing. That's where the creativity comes in, and kind
Yeah.
of looking at past pen test reports and DFIR reports, and be like, oh, threat actors are going to look for these types of documents. I'm going to put these as canaries in my environment.
Absolutely.
So honeypots are great. Also a very deep topic and kind of deep subject in and of itself. Some of the tools, like I mentioned, are Things Canary. They have a commercial product where you can like plug this in your network and it does this for you. Super cool. A lot of people really, really love that. Open Canary, again, it's the open source version that you can manage yourself and have in your own environment. And then Active Defense Harbinger distribution is just like a good resource as a whole. It's kind of like a blanket resource or an umbrella resource for a lot of different cyber deception, active defense type tools that I mentioned earlier are like denial type things and frustration and like, messing with the threat actor once they get on the environment kind of stuff. So really good resource as well by BHIS.
Hmm.
And that's on GitHub as well.
Yep.
The last section is lures. So lures, I think of clues and kind of maybe think of them as like tripwires. So these are things that threat actors might not necessarily know they're tripping over. The canaries and the honeypots, they might not know they're tripping over as well, but this is more subtle, in my opinion. This takes the form of like fake event logs or fake RDP history or fake, shell history if you're on Unix, right? Like bash history files and stuff like that. Those are kind of like little subtle things that are like a breadcrumb that lead to something else. So maybe
Hmm.
you do want the threat actor to pivot to a certain network or observe files in a certain file share, but maybe you don't have a good path to get there, or maybe it's not obvious that that's there. So you plant these little breadcrumbs like fake history files and log files, or you map a fake drive or something like that. It's just a breadcrumb that attacker can follow, and you're kind of guiding them down a specific path and kind of away from your critical resources, the resources you actually want to detect. This
Mhm.
gets into a little bit of like the obfuscation part of it, which I said we weren't going to talk about, but here we are. I'm a liar. But it can also be used for threat detection because obviously you're leaving bait for the threat actor, right?
Yeah.
You're steering them towards something and away from something else, which is ultimately, what we're trying to do and ultimately detect them earlier. So, yeah.
So what's funny is we actually used this technique, but we didn't have a name for it. I don't even think we realized that we were doing this. But
Yep.
so what we would do is we would go into an HR folder and just drop a link to a file on the canary,
Mhm.
right? And so that would be a really good example of this, is that like this link, this shortcut or whatever, doesn't necessarily do anything. But if you're snooping around in an HR directory and you stumble onto this link that is like, go view the salary report for executives,
Yep.
now they're going to click on that. It's going to take them to my canary token, or take them
Yep.
to my canary or my honeypot. But yeah, same thing with like registry entries, right? You might have a honey account somewhere, and I'm going to have some registry entries using terms that you might search for to kind of guide
Yep.
you there. And what I love about this so much is they don't think twice about it, right? If you're an attacker and you find this account in the registry somewhere, you're not going to be like, what you're going to do is you're immediately going to go see what kind of access this thing has, how privileged the account is, and in doing that, you're going to get caught, right?
Yep.
But it's different from them like enumerating Active Directory and finding the account that you've set up because you named it to look vulnerable. That throws flags in my mind. But if I find it on my own
Yep.
as part of a lure and it leads me to where I get caught, that is a much more believable process.
Yep, definitely. And there's a project in researching notes for this episode. I came across a project called Deja Vu, which I hadn't heard of before, and I haven't used it or tested it. So take that with a grain of salt. But it's really cool. It's a Deja Vu is an open source deception platform, and what I think is really cool about it is it is a tool that allows you to create decoys or kind of deception technology in on-prem networks and in the cloud, but it's kind of focused more on the lures aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, a lot of attackers or many attackers might run Bloodhound or the Sharphound collector in an environment, right? Well, this tool can help you create kind of DNS records in fake information that can be fed into that Bloodhound report. Again, not necessarily a canary that's like immediate detection. It's a lure. It's kind of a deception technique to kind of steer attackers away from the sensitive stuff and kind of down the path that you want. And I thought that was really cool. And there's other examples too in that repository of like, setting up fake hosts to respond to responder and invade type of attacks or LMNR poisoning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Super cool kind of stuff because we know threat actors are going to get in there. They might try to abuse legacy protocols and stuff. So that would be really cool as well as kind of a decoy or a lure kind of thing. But I thought the DNS records, the kind of fake data fed into the tools that the attackers are using is another kind of interesting approach to deception.
Love it, man. Absolutely love it.
So I know we're like 38 minutes in right now, but the last section is kind of how do we integrate this into our defensive strategy?
Mm-hmm.
So I think about a few things. I think about placement, where we place it, and where we place decoys, where attackers are going to go. I think about, making them realistic, and then I think about testing them. So those are the three things we'll kind of, wrap up talking about. The first is placing decoys where they're likely to go. We've talked about this in passing a little bit in this episode, but to really drive home the point, I think it's important to consider where you put these, right? Because if you have a password document and you put it on some IoT network that a threat actor is never going to touch, it's useless, right? Like there's no point. Same goes in the opposite, right? If you are on an IoT network and all of a sudden you see some like HR, payroll document that might not fit the environment, it might not fit the context, and context is everything, as we know.
Mm-hmm.
So think about your high value targets, backup servers, your crown jewels, domain controllers, your file shares. Think about those things and what you would likely see there, or what would likely be there that you could drop as a canary or a decoy or something like that.
Yeah, totally agree, man. We were fortunate enough to be able to emulate a lot of the things that are out there, and you can too, man. Like it's so easy to emulate a VoIP phone, right? Like they all behave a
Yep.
certain way. They always have this port open. We would even go so far as to change the MAC address of the device to be a Cisco MAC address.
Yep.
Right, so that it didn't look weird if you were like, using a tool that automatically converted it to its manufacturer Mac,
Yep.
block or whatever. So yeah, it's the little things I think that make the difference on this.
Yep.
So attention to detail is going to be important here if you want this to be effective.
Yep. Same with making them realistic and kind of making them feel like they fit the environment. A good example of this is like creating an Active Directory account called like Jon Snow or
Honeypot account.
or honeypot account, or calling it Iron Man, or some obvious thing that you wouldn't normally call an account, or Jane Doe or John Smith kind of thing.
Yep.
So that is an obvious kind of tell that, oh, maybe this is a test account or it's not actually a real user. The other things are when you're creating accounts, like Honey accounts, are the recent logins, the recent password changes, failed logins, the last time the password was changed kind of thing. Another example is if you have a service or a process running on a machine called Honey credentials or Honey tokens or something like that, which I've seen commercial products do.
Yep.
That's, an obvious tell, right? Like, of course, we're going to avoid those processes or dumping credentials on that machine because we know they're going to have fake data in them, fake credentials and stuff. So making them look and feel real and match the environment is a real key here.
Yeah, when we first started deploying the canaries, it's really tempting to check all the boxes in the config, right? And for those of you that haven't seen the interface, what that means is like I'm going to emulate an Active Directory domain controller, and I'm going to emulate a web server, and I'm going to emulate an HR share, and like it's really easy to want to be like, yeah, I want to do all that. Right. But then, someone actually looks at what's running on that box and suddenly it's like, why would a domain controller have like a web page portal? Like, it doesn't make
Yep.
sense, right? And so yeah, so be strategic, and just use your thinking a little bit when you're putting this stuff together.
Yep. And the last thing is test them. Obviously, when you're deploying these things, especially when you have a number of these things, you obviously want to document where they are and keep track of those things, but it's really important to test them. There's no point in deploying some sort of deception technology if you don't know if it works, if you don't know if you get alerts from it. So testing it is really important, making sure that it works and
Yep.
making sure you're getting that data somewhere that is actionable. So whether an email alert or an email notification or an alert in your SIM or whatever product, making sure that you test it and making sure that it gets to you in the appropriate way, in appropriate amount of time is really important.
Yeah, if you're buying, I don't know about the open source canaries, but the paid like commercial canaries, they have a heartbeat. That goes back to the cloud portal, and you'll get an alert if it drops, right? If it
Yep.
stops doing its thing. But the other thing that we would do is just write very basic scripts to go out and touch the honeypot to initiate an alert that would circle back to our blue team,
Yep.
and it would be on like the first Monday of the month at noon. So it was really easy to know that it was just our check scripts. But that kind of confirmed to us that A, it's up, and two, it's actually operating as intended. To your point, right?
Yep. Yeah, and that's really it. I just have some last minute kind of tips for challenges, like kind of considerations. And it's, the first one's false positives. So obviously, if you deploy thousands of these canaries and stuff like that, there's a diminishing return on, the amount of stuff that you have to manage versus the amount of data that you get or the alerts that you get. So balancing, that is important to, reduce the amount of noise, right? Because your EDR generates all alerts. SIM, we're kind of inundated with alerts. So we want to make sure that the stuff that we do deploy is high fidelity, and we are trying to reduce the noise. Integrating with existing systems is important, right? If you are setting up a deception technology and it doesn't integrate with anything, if it has to be managed on its own, there are considerations there. So ideally, it would send you an email alert or integrate with your SIM or something like that that integrates well into your existing security stack, if you will. And then, regular update and maintenance. Again, you mentioned, all the heartbeats, making sure that it works, making sure that it updates with your environment and kind of changes as your environment changes are all things to consider. But that's it. We've gone super long, so that's all I think I've got.
No, I love it. I would just encourage you to, if you're planning on doing this, take your time, go slow, and make it relevant to what, like you said, what fits in your tech stack and all that good stuff. But most importantly, just do this. Right. That's my takeaway for today is I need you to consider putting these types of technologies in your environment because it is important. And we have been caught on multiple pen tests because of honey tokens or honeypots. And so it works, right? I can personally attest to this thing working in a real environment in my experience. So all right, folks, that's all we have for you today. We talked about deception technology and how it can enhance your cyber defense strategy. I really appreciate you guys taking the time to listen and or watch, depending on how you're consuming it. So please share it. That really helps us out a lot. We want to get the word out about what we're talking about and what we're doing. Yeah, we'll see you next time.